Not all power announces itself. Some of it never appears on paper. No official title, no board appointment, no signed declaration filed in any registry. And yet, it is understood. Understood in the way a room shifts when a certain individual enters. Understood in who speaks first and who waits. Understood in which suggestions become decisions without debate. Power does not always need a nameplate. Sometimes it only needs recognition. By the end of the 2000s, European authorities were mapping expansion across multiple countries. New chapters forming, territories consolidating, cross-border coordination increasing in sophistication. Investigations in Germany, the Netherlands, and Scandinavia began identifying patterns, travel movements, meeting attendance, shared events, overlapping financial interests. Outlaw motorcycle clubs were not static social groups. They were structured networks. But within those networks, hierarchy did not always mirror corporate models. There were presidents, vice presidents, sergeants at arms. Titles existed, but titles alone did not always define influence. And that raised a persistent question. Who truly leads inside decentralized outlaw structures? In traditional organizations, leadership leaves documentation. There are corporate filings, shareholder disclosures, official minutes, signed contracts. Accountability is attached to paper. But outlaw motorcycle culture operates through a different logic. Authority flows through seniority, through personal history, through the ability to command loyalty without issuing orders. It flows through reputation, and reputation cannot be subpoenaed. After conviction, after prison, after deportation from Germany to Turkey in the mid-2000s, the public story could have ended. For many individuals, removal from one country means removal from influence. But in the case of Necati Arabaci, investigative reporting in subsequent years continued to note his name in proximity to biker developments in Turkey and parts of Europe. Not always as a declared leader, not always as an office holder, but present, referenced, connected, associated, in intelligence monitoring, in media investigations, in cross-border briefings. And that distinction matters. For law enforcement, documentation is everything. Proving control over a company requires contracts, bank transfers, emails, board resolutions. Proving influence inside a brotherhood requires something far more complex. Patterns. Who attends which meetings? Whose arrival changes voting outcomes? Who mediates disputes between chapters? Whose name is invoked when decisions are contested? In decentralized organizations, power often exists without a signature. It exists in repetition, in deference, in the absence of opposition. This is where myth begins to blur with documentation. Outlaw motorcycle clubs cultivate mystique. They operate with controlled visibility, recognizable patches, recognizable insignias, recognizable events. But internal power structures are rarely public. Official roles can rotate, presidents can change, chapters can be reorganized, yet reputational gravity often remains fixed. And reputational gravity does not require a title. Was Arabaci a formal leader during later European expansions? Or was he an influential figure whose prior status and network carried weight beyond any specific office? Public records provide fragments. Court documents outline earlier convictions. Journalistic investigations reference proximity and alleged influence. But outlaw hierarchies rarely provide clarity. And ambiguity is not an accident. Ambiguity protects the structure. Because when leadership is diffused, when influence is informal, accountability becomes harder to attach. You cannot indict a reputation. You must prove conduct. Outlaw motorcycle clubs thrive on layered visibility. Externally, they are highly visible. Motorcycles, colors, clubhouses, public gatherings. Internally, decision-making is more opaque. The most influential figures are not always the most vocal. They are not always the ones giving speeches. They are often the ones who do not need to, the ones whose silence carries meaning, the ones whose approval is assumed. the ones who can influence outcomes simply by being present. By the 2010s, European biker investigations had matured significantly. Authorities improved financial tracking. Cross-border intelligence sharing strengthened through Europol frameworks. Joint task forces monitored organized crime mobility between Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Scandinavia. Patterns became clearer, but decentralized influence remained difficult to prosecute unless tied directly to documented criminal activity. And that distinction is critical. Visibility is not proof. Association is not command. Reputation is not a legal offense. To secure conviction, prosecutors require evidence of action, not aura. Season 1 began in Cologne, behind velvet ropes, inside nightclubs, amid shifting immigrant economies and expanding urban nightlife. It moved through courtrooms, through surveillance files, through prison corridors. It followed deportation, relocation, repositioning, and now it ends with a question that rarely has a clean answer. What is power if it does not need to be declared? Because in structured criminal ecosystems, endurance often outweighs visibility. Headlines fade, sentences are served, but networks adapt. Influence can persist across geography. It can survive incarceration. It can survive deportation. It can survive silence, especially when it is embedded not in a document but in collective memory. Within outlaw culture, recognition is currency. Years served, conflicts navigated, alliances forged, loyalty demonstrated. These are not items listed on LinkedIn profiles. They are internal credentials, and internal credentials do not expire when a border is crossed. If reputation precedes you, it can also follow you. Empires in the shadows do not rely on corporate architecture. They rely on relational architecture. Who trusts whom? Who owes whom? Who defers to whom? Titles can be reassigned. Respect is negotiated over decades. And when respect solidifies into recognition, influence no longer requires declaration. It becomes assumed. For investigators, that presents an enduring dilemma. How do you prosecute something that does not formally exist? How do you demonstrate hierarchy inside a structure that denies centralized command? How do you distinguish between symbolic presence and operational control? These are not philosophical questions. They are courtroom questions, and the answers must meet evidentiary standards. Necati Arabaci's trajectory from nightclub operator in Germany to convicted figure, to deportee, to a name still cited in later investigative reporting, illustrates the complexity of informal power. Whether formal leader or influential elder, his story reflects a broader truth about decentralized organizations. Power can migrate, can adapt, and it can detach itself from official titles without disappearing. In public narratives, leadership is often simplified. There is a boss, a chain of command, a visible authority figure. But in networked structures, particularly those rooted in loyalty and subculture, leadership is often distributed. Influence may sit at the center without sitting at the top. And that distinction changes how systems endure. Season 1 documented the rise, from migration-era Germany, to nightlife economies, to conviction, to expansion beyond borders. Season 2 will examine the ecosystem itself, not only individuals, but the structure that sustains them. Because to understand influence, you must understand the architecture that allows it to persist. Power without title, authority without paperwork, recognition without announcement. Some influence is loud, some influence is signed, and some influence exists quietly, understood, unspoken, and difficult to erase.